I remember waking up one morning. It was a Sunday, and we had been out the day before on a river like fishing floating trip with some friends, and I remember waking up and not knowing that if we had a physical altercation or not in the house. Um, and I was on the couch and I just stumbled outside, and the back door I'd ripped it off the hinges somehow, like it was literally off the
Hmm.
hinges, and I just got so scared. Um,
Yeah.
that something had happened that I had done something to her and not known it, and nothing happened. Um, I never, we never had a physical altercation. It just in my mind, that's what I
Hmm.
thought. Um, and I went and woke her up, and told her, I said, I'm never doing this again.
Welcome to Real Man Talk, discussing the tough issues facing men and their families every day. Here's Anthony Kernott and Carla Sau.
What's up, guys? Welcome to Women Talk. Today, I've got a very special guest for you, all the way from Virginia, and Jeremy Hodnett, and he's going to give you guys his testimony. He's going to tell us about the redemption of God. We're going to talk about all kinds of different stuff, and I'm so excited for you guys to meet him. Without further ado, Jeremy, what is going on, man?
Hey, Anthony, thank you for having me on today. I'm really just honored to be here. I never would have expected to be on a podcast, let alone a uh, men- men's Christian discipleship podcast. I guess that's the
Yeah,
right way to put it. How'd
yeah,
you put that?
that's we
Okay.
call it men's podcast, whatever, call it whatever you want.
Men's podcast, yeah, ministry podcast. I never would have expected to be here, man. Yeah, the Lord has definitely led me
Yeah.
here. That's for sure. I was talking to somebody about that, and I said, I'm just, whatever the Lord leads me to do, I'm going to say yes. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to say yes. And now I've yesed my way to here.
All right. Well, I'm excited you're here, and so we got to talk
Yeah.
this past Saturday, and we got to know each other a little bit, and I get to hear your testimony, and I was like, man, I've got to have you on. I'm so looking forward to the men of this podcast, the men who listen to this podcast, to be able to hear your testimony, and because I
Yeah.
think your testimony, one relates to a lot of other men, right, that have
Mhm.
gone through similar situations, and or may be in a similar situation, right?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
and we know that the redemptive power of Christ works in our lives, and and stuff. And so,
Mhm.
my favorite question, and I should have warned you about this, but I didn't. So this is gonna be good. My favorite question is tell me your story.
You want the
The
whole
whole
thing?
thing. The whole thing. We got
All
time.
right, man. Okay. So, well, I grew up in Danville, Virginia. It's a little town like in the south part of the state, right up against the North Carolina border. Grew up on a tobacco farm here, and just a rural farming community. Very conservative values. Parents went to church. I went to church. I got saved when I was 10 years old. Um, my childhood was a little different than a lot of kids I went to school with. I grew up on a farm, so my summers were spent, not at the beach, not hanging out with friends. I had the kid's dream, man. I grew up with four-wheelers and tractors and
Yeah.
horses and no parental supervision because what are you going to do? You're in the middle of
Right.
nowhere, right? Like just come home at dark. So yeah, I lived a really good childhood. Um, and when I turned 16, I got my driver's license, and that's when the wheels fell off the bus. I was very active in the youth group until that point. Went to church a lot because that's what you did, and then I got my license, and I got in with the wrong crowd and kind of spiraled from there.
Hmm.
Um, so when I turned 18, my family sold the farm, and so I was kind of unmoored because I thought I was going to farm. That was going to be my career path,
Yeah.
and when you turn 18, that's when you make your big decisions,
Right.
right? And I felt like mine was kind of taken away from me. Not that I held any malice towards, my
Hmm.
family or anything like that.
Just confusion.
Just the decision that they made.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had been in the volunteer fire department. I joined when I was 16 years old. I said, well, I like I like doing fire and EMS. I'd gotten my EMT at in high school through the VOTEC program. I said, great, I'll go be an EMT. There's a private ambulance company in town that um, they'll take
Hmm.
anybody. You got an EMT license, they'll hire you. They need bodies and trucks, and so I did that. And they they were for profit, so they will send you to anything and
Hmm.
everything, and that meant all the calls that the volunteers didn't want to take, they would send
Hmm.
us, and so that because of that, you wound up with a lot of people who were using the
Hmm.
system as a taxi cab service. So they would literally call you to get across
Oh,
town,
wow.
and you can't refuse them, and they know that you can't refuse
Right.
them. So they would call you, pick them up, and because of that, you got jaded very quickly. Like you really lost respect for the people who needed your services.
Mm.
Um, so you're dealing with that burnout effect that you'll hear about sometimes with first responders. You get that burnout, and that's what that a lot of that is just people who abuse the system,
Yeah,
um,
for sure.
and then you get tired
Now
of it.
let me ask you this. So
And
here you are, you're 18, right?
yep, 18
And
years
you're
old.
already experiencing this because people are abusing the system. Man, that's
Yep.
early. Yeah.
So yeah, so not only that, but the company did body transports as well. So you would literally go scrape people up off the road,
Oh,
and like out of houses and stuff. They would be there for weeks sometimes. Yeah, and because they made money doing that,
yeah.
and so they sent me in there to get them up.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
so you saw a lot more than you probably should have that early.
Yeah. So
Um,
I'm trying to process this, right? Because we didn't get this deep into
mhm.
it whenever we talked Saturday.
No, we didn't. Yeah.
And so here you are, you're 18 years old, right? And I'm trying
Hmm.
to picture this, right? 18 years old, having to go pick up dead
Hmm.
bodies, right?
Yep.
So the
Yep.
trauma, right, that you must have
Hmm.
experienced at a young age, right,
Hmm.
had man that had to be devastating,
Yeah, but you didn't know it at the
right?
time. Like you just, as men, we are professional compartmentalization
Yes, we
experts.
are.
Like you put it in that little box and you just say, well, that's done. We don't have to deal with that anymore. And then the next time it happens, maybe you don't fit it all in that box. And the next time, maybe just a little bit less fits in that box until eventually, man, you're running out of boxes, dude. Like you ain't got no more
Yeah.
space. So yeah, so I did that, and let's see, I was doing that. I had moved out of the house at 18 because I was still living a life apart from God at that point, and I was living by my own set of rules. I was 18 years old. I could do what I wanted.
Hmm.
I was seeing more than any of my family had ever
Hmm.
seen. So I was going to live the way I wanted to, and because of that, my parents said, well, our house, our rules. You can't abide by them. There's a door, and
Right.
I respected them for that,
Yeah.
but I found a different way to live, and I lived in my truck for a while. Um, I lived in a volunteer department that I was volunteering at. They had like a live-in station that I could stay at, so I did that, and then I was able to afford an apartment. I couldn't afford it. So I got in this cycle where I was working two EMS jobs and working for my landlord and working for my dad, all to pay the rent on the
Mm.
apartment. So I had four jobs. I didn't sleep unless I was getting paid to. Um,
Good grief.
yeah, so I was doing that. Yeah, and so then you're you're functioning on no sleep for a couple
Yeah.
years, pretty much, and you're getting all the stuff thrown at you. Pretty much the only thing that was good that came out of that time was I met my wife. So she was a paramedic at the private ambulance company I worked for, and I met her on the back end of that job when I was walking out the door. I saw her, and I was dating another girl at the time. I said, I'm gonna marry this girl, and left that job, broke up with my girlfriend, sweet girl, just the
Yeah.
Lord told me, even though this is the one for you. And I went to her house and I told her, I said, I want to date you and I'll marry you. And so, yeah, so that's what we did in that storyline. Main storyline, went to another department, did that for a couple of years, and then I got hired on at like a big inner city department, doing inner city firefighting, which was my end
Mm-hmm.
goal. That's what I wanted to do. And I remember sitting in recruit academy, and I'm one of those people where, like, if you tell me not to do something, that's normally what I'm gonna wind up
Yes,
doing.
I
And
can relate.
so they're like, yeah, they're like the end of the recruit academy. They're like, yeah, what we don't want to see you do is like self-medicate with alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what do you mean you can self-medicate with alcohol? Like, what are you self-medicating for? And they start talking about PTSD, and I'm like, well, I think I got that already. Like I've checked that box. You mean alcohol is going to help with the PTSD? And I drank, but it wasn't anything
Mm-hmm.
serious. It's just social. And so the light bulb went off. I was like, man, I might be able to help this out.
Yeah.
So I started drinking. As soon as I got hired at that department, I started drinking heavily, um, heavily. So I lasted about 3 years and got a DUI.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've really excelled at that department. I was on a very good career path, and then I derailed myself with a DUI, and they couldn't keep me because of
Mm-hmm.
it. And so I had to resign because of that. And this whole time, like, God was not in my life. I was actively against God. I was against religion. I didn't believe. I didn't. I just had so many questions. I doubted everything. I thought I was smarter than God.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I was the smartest person in the world, right? I had it
Yeah.
figured out. Um, and I remember, like, that you get that little itch. I got the DUI, and I remember thinking, well, God, if you're there, like, what do you want me to do?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember him answering me. Uh, my dad just has so much grace and mercy, like any parent does for their child. He's like, I knew this was going to happen, son. I wish you would have told me
Yeah.
that, a couple years ago. It'd been nice, but he said, I'll get you a job if you want it. And keep in mind, I had no license, no driver's license, no nothing. And so when we sold the farm, we bought a septic tank cleaning business, and there just wasn't enough work for me there at the time. But I was working part time for him. And when I lost my job, he said, I'll get you a job. He said, I'll buy you a truck. And he said, but you got to promise me, you know, you'll stay clean.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. I promised him that. And he bought a truck. There's kind of a loophole. You can buy a truck that you don't need a CDL for, but it still does what it needs to do.
Right.
So he did that. He went out and he dropped, whatever amount of money it was to put me in a truck to give me a job to you know, uh, provide for my family. It was just me and my wife at the
Mm-hmm.
time. And he did that, and I worked there, and I felt a I felt God's presence for maybe 3 months, and then I was back in the same track I was in. I drinking,
Mm-hmm.
drinking worse than I was when I was at the fire department because I didn't have to show up to a 24-hour shift.
Right.
You know, I just drank every day. I'd come home from work and I'd drink, and anyway, so I did that um, for years, and I remember it had gotten pretty bad to the point where my wife, who also, I don't want to drag her into this, but she drank with
Mm-hmm.
me, and I remember waking up one morning. It was a Sunday, and we had been out the day before on a river like fishing floating trip with some friends, and I remember waking up and not knowing that if we had a physical altercation or not in the house. Um, and I was on the couch and I just stumbled outside, and the back door I'd ripped it off the hinges somehow, like it was literally off the
Mm-hmm.
hinges, and I just got so scared um,
Yeah.
that something had happened that I had done something to her and not known it, and nothing happened. Um, I never, we never had a physical altercation. It just in my mind, that's what I
Mm-hmm.
thought. Um, and I went and woke her up, and I told her, I said, I'm never doing this again. Um, she said, well, you're just saying that
Yeah.
because you're hungover and you feel bad. We'll talk about it later. And I said, nope. And then she's the one person that if I ever tell her something in earnest, um, I never want her to look at me and think that I'm not a man of my word.
Right.
So when I tell her something, that's the one person when I tell stuff to. You know,
Yeah.
if I can't keep a promise to somebody else, I'm always going to keep it to
Yeah.
her. So yeah, so that was my sobriety moment. That was about 5 years ago now. In September,
Mm-hmm.
it'll be 6. Um, I still didn't believe in God. Still was. I don't know if didn't believe would be a good term for it. And agnostic is a little too watered down. Just really struggling with the concept of God.
Right.
Um, so yeah, so I had all this time on my hands because I didn't drink anymore. So I got into hunting, in the fall and turkeys in the spring. And after you, not to be morbid, man, but when you cut up enough animals, like if you can't see God's providence and how, he created animals,
Mm-hmm.
just all the intricate details of how they're put together. I mean, I don't know, you must be blind,
Right.
because it's insane. Anyway, Um, and I found myself praying a lot when I was out there and just, talking to God and wasn't really sure what to do. Didn't really know like what I believed or anything. And we got pregnant with my first child, my daughter, Julie, and uh, I remember like, about 6 months after she was born, I was there at home with her by myself and just dealing with a lot of depression, a lot of probably PTSD still
Mm-hmm.
from being in the fire service. And when you live that life, and we talk about this, and you live that life of the the drinking and the just, and then you start centering yourself on God. You go through this period of just shame and guilt,
Mm-hmm.
man. Like it just weighs on you. And my marriage was in shambles at that point. Me and my wife were having problems, and then I remember feeling so bad and just praying to God, just please don't let this child find me in 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, who I've been, who I am. Don't let her find me. And I was really wrestling with that. Like how do I how do I shield her from myself in 20 years, and how do I show her, who I would hope her to find, if she gets married. And I remember God talking to me, and we if you have one of those moments with God, you know it.
Mm-hmm.
He talks to you and he said, don't be that person. Don't be that man. Don't be that guy. Show her what you want her to be. And, I'm just a dumb redneck from a Virginia, he's got to talk to me pretty plain. And I was like, oh yeah, like I could just be a decent guy. I could not do all this stuff. I could go to church, if that's what I wanted to, a Christian man, if that's what I wanted to find, I could be that
Mm-hmm.
man. Um, and that kind of started me down this rabbit hole of, well, maybe I should go to church. And I remember calling my wife, and she, like I said, she was at work, and I don't know if I called her or texted her. I said, hey, tomorrow we're going to church, and she's okay. What you do now,
Yeah.
right? And I said, no, I just want to go. I think we should go. And we talked about it, and she was she was supportive, but I could tell she had her reservations
Mm-hmm.
about it too. Um, but I also know that, the man is the leader of the Christian
Mm-hmm.
family. That's no secret,
That's
right?
right.
So if I'm going to go, then everybody else is going to go.
Right.
Um, so yeah, so we started going to church, and I had drawn a, and we haven't talked about this yet, but I'm going to get into something
Yeah.
else just for
Yeah.
a
No,
second
you're
or
good.
two. Um, I'd drawn an elk tag in New Mexico with a buddy of mine that I worked with at the fire department, and I was training for that hunt because I was like, I don't want to go out there and be some fat
Yeah.
slob and not be able to walk up and down these hills, Like, I don't want them waiting on me and sucking wind and stuff. It was a bow hunt, so it's a lot of um, heart rate training and stuff, like in the moment, like you want your heart rate down. And so I started running a lot, and she signed me up, unbeknownst to me, for a double marathon, like in 6 months, like 6 months post this uh, hunt that I was
Mm-hmm.
doing. Wasn't successful on the hunt. My buddy killed one, but I
Yeah.
didn't. And um, so yeah, so I was just like, well, I need to keep running now. I got to do this
Yeah.
thing,
So what
double
is a double
marathon.
marathon?
So the one I did was the Roanoke double. So it's the Roanoke Marathon. It's about, I think it's 3,000 feet of elevation gain over 26 miles. Um, it's steep
Yeah.
for a road race. It's steep. Um, so that starts at 7 a.m. Well, the double, you start a marathon. You run that same course at 1 a.m. And then when you finish with that, you take a little break or whatever you want to do, and then at 7 a.m. you start with everybody else and you run the next
Oh
marathon.
my
So it's
gosh. You
52
started at 1 a.m.
miles. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I started at 1. I'm actually doing it again in 2 weeks, but I'm trying to forget about that because I forgot that I signed up for it. Um, so I was freaking
Yeah.
out.
Glutton for punishment, I
So
think.
I, yeah, well, we'll get to that. Um, so I was freaking out. And I'm like, man, what am I going to do? So I called the cross country coach from the high school that I went to. Never ran cross country, just knew him. They run by my house all the
Yeah.
time. I scream at him when they run by. And I was like, hey, LC, I'm getting ready to run this race. I don't know anything about. Like, what do I need to do? And he gave me JJ Vogeltan's number. He's like, I don't know anything about him, dude. Call this guy. He runs them all the time. He's crazy. So I talked to JJ on the phone for like 30 minutes one day, and he's like, "Yeah, finish that race and talk to me." And me and him started running together, and we started doing all these ultra marathons together. Um, yeah, and
No,
so
man.
the first one, I know, oh man, hey, well, I think a lot of it, I needed a way to fill that gap with the alcohol.
Right. I mean, that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, so I liked hurting myself, and you're right. I'm just a glutton for punishment, man, and that's just one way. I'm like, well, I can, this might actually be kind of good for me, kinda
Yeah.
mentally, probably not physically, but um, if you want to hurt, that's a good way
That's
to
a good
hurt.
way to hurt.
Um, yeah, so I started doing that, and then about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago, I found myself running, and I was running with JJ, and we were in our own little worlds or whatever, just kind of talking to ourselves, and I was like, man, I don't know why I'm doing this anymore. Like, I don't know what God's doing with me. Like, I don't feel like I'm out here for myself anymore. I feel like He's working through me for something. And sure enough, I had a race like 2 weeks after that, and I wound up witnessing to this guy like during the race, like in the pouring down rain. It's like 50 degrees, and it's dumping rain, and I'm talking to this guy, and I came back and I was talking to JJ about it after the fact. And he's like, well, maybe that's what God's calling you to do. Maybe you should keep running these dang races and um, witnessing to people.
Yeah.
And I was like, you think I could find something a little bit easier to do? Like, I'd start a coffee shop ministry or something, man. Like, this sucks.
That's funny.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of how I wound up getting into that deal. Was I had one, I had to fill that hole that the alcohol
Mm-hmm.
left, and the other was, I think, God's starting to use it for me for some type of ministry.
Yeah.
Um, Nothing set in stone or anything yet. I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with it. But
Yeah.
anyway,
There's
yeah.
a good friend of mine. He's a mentor and of mine, and he when he was going through seminary school, he
Hmm.
there was this guy. He said he was kind of a hippie looking, kind of guy, kind of had the dreads, the whole thing, and
Yeah.
he was going through seminary with him, and he said towards the end of it, they were all kind of talking about what they were going to be doing. He's like, I'm going rock climbing. It's like God's called me to rock climb.
Okay.
He said, you get up there, they ain't go nowhere.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what he
Exactly.
did after he was done. He climbed up sides of mountains and tell people about Jesus. It takes all kinds,
Yeah.
right? I mean, everybody needs
Yeah.
Jesus, and I'm just glad it's you and not me. And so,
Yeah. Thanks a lot, buddy.
yeah, man, I tell you what, if I'm running, everybody better be running. Now, my thing was always powerlifting, right? I liked it.
That's so. I did that when I was at the fire
Did you?
station. Yeah, I was big
Yeah,
on that.
I
Yeah.
like to lift heavy weights, and stuff like that. But I hate.
Hmm.
Whenever I say hate, I loathe cardio.
Hmm.
I hate it. And so,
Oh, me too.
yeah, you're in the wrong
I
ministry there,
know,
dude.
man.
No, and
Yeah.
but yeah, dude. So listen. Let's jump into this. Here you are. You
Hmm.
are you're a firefighter experiencing unbelievable trauma, even at a very, very young age, right? I
Hmm.
mean, your brain has not even fully grown yet at 18, right? And
Right.
and so you're experiencing this trauma. How much of that, do you think really led into your alcoholism?
Um, Probably 60 to
Yeah,
75%. Um, it's still a lifestyle choice. You still,
right.
you choose to live that life. So I'd probably say, 60 to 75% of it was that. Um,
Yeah. Well, the thing that I've noticed dealing with men, one, all of us experience trauma, right? Not all of it's in the way that you've experienced trauma, right?
mhm.
But we've all experienced some type of trauma, whether it's abandonment, whether it's being hurt, whether it's something like that, right?
Sure.
Um, but especially when it comes to first responders, we talked a little bit about this before the podcast. Especially when it comes to like first responders, firefighters, police officers, EMTs, right? Um, and a lot of times I find that they self medicate to
Mhm.
um, to get over the trauma, right? Just be able to sleep at night, right, without the nightmares and without all that stuff. And so, um, but here you are now, right? I really want to get into the redemptive work of Christ in your life, right?
Yes, sir.
Um, because so many men, whether they have dealt with the things that you've dealt with, have been in a similar position as you were with alcohol, right?
Mhm.
Man, I talk to guys all the time, right? Um, I mean, you're over 21 years old. It's legal, right? I mean, everybody,
Right. Yeah.
everybody grabs a beer after work and, and all, it's social.
It's the cool thing to
Yeah,
do, man.
all the time. I work with guys right now. They don't drink water at all. Like like all they drink is alcohol, right? Here I'm out here sweating my butt off, drinking
Yep.
bottles of water, just fast as I can get them. And I'm like, you guys want some water?
Yep.
Nah, we'll grab beer after work, and I'm going, what is it? How do you function? Anyways, um, but they find themselves in the same position as you are,
Yep.
were. And what separates you from who you were, right,
Mhm.
is the redemptive work of Christ in your life, right?
Right.
Christ calling out to you. So last night I I I had the opportunity to speak in a little town next, not too far from where we're at, and it was like a recovery group, right? You know, alcohol, lots of drugs, and stuff like that.
Sure.
But the message that he gave me, God gave me, was in Luke, and I won't get directly into scriptures, but um,
Mm-hmm.
in Luke it talks about Peter, right? When Peter denied Jesus, um, it says that Jesus made eye contact with him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and I
Yeah.
think about the shame, right? We talked a little bit about that, right? The guilt and the shame that Peter must have felt, you want to talk about um, completely,
God's looking right
yeah.
at you. Jesus is looking
And
right
you're
at you.
rejecting him, right? I mean, and the guy just
Yeah.
told him he was going to do it earlier that day, right? And
Yeah.
but you want to talk about guilt and shame, right? Rejecting Jesus the way that
Mm-hmm.
he did, abandoning Jesus the way that all the other disciples abandoned him. Judas and Peter betrayed him, right?
Right.
One betrayed him for silver, the other one betrayed him for fear. And
Right.
I think about the way that Peter must have felt, right? Which we've all felt
Mm-hmm.
that, right? We've all come to this realization that we have betrayed Jesus, right? We've done so much bad, so much. We've dropped the ball so many times. We've done, all this stuff. But if you go to
Yes.
the book of Mark, right, this gives me such hope at the resurrection, and Mark
Mm-hmm.
16, um, chapter 16, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, or the mother of James, I'm sorry, goes to Jesus, right? They're going to put spices in the tombs or whatever. The angel's not there,
Mm-hmm.
or the angel's there. Jesus is not there. And he's like, hey, he said, go tell the disciples and Peter, right? So this is 3 days later
Yeah.
after this has happened, after Peter has completely rejected and betrayed Jesus. And God wanted Peter to know, hey, I realize that you betrayed me. I realize, all this stuff, but I want you to know that I still love you. I want you to know that I still have a plan for you, right? And he calls him out by name.
Right.
He didn't call any other disciple out. It was only Peter he called out by name. And
Mm-hmm.
it's that gives me so much hope, right? It gives me
Right.
so much hope. Gives me hope because I know that even in those times when you find yourself betraying Jesus, right, which is what sin does,
Right.
right? We're separating ourselves from Him, all this stuff. That there's still hope. There's still a calling on our lives, right? My identity hasn't changed. Peter's identity didn't change from being a disciple of Christ, right? Even though he betrayed
Right.
him, God still, prior to all of this happening, he told me, he said, I'm going to build my church, right, on you,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're going to be the rock. I'm going to
Right.
build my church on you. And that didn't
Yeah.
change. That calling that he had on him, that identity that Jesus had placed on him didn't change, even though he completely betrayed Jesus. And,
Mm-hmm.
when we find ourselves in these spots like you were at, and we've all been there, right? Maybe it's not alcohol. For me, it was pornography, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
when we find ourselves in these spots, and we realize that we've gone too far, right? We can't in and of ourselves
Right.
turn away, right? There's got to be something. There, we've got to have some kind of help, right? Whether it's some kind of realization from family, whether it's, you're not just going to up and quit yourself. There's got to be something.
Right.
Most of the time, it's a for me, it was divine intervention from Christ, right? And
Right.
when we come to these realizations that oh my goodness. For example, I remember I was 19 years old when the Lord changed my life, right? So I was a very
Mm-hmm.
rebellious kid. The first time I ran for the cops, I was 12. I was, my poor parents, I tell you what, um, I was just very, very rebellious, very angry, all that stuff. Um, I remember being 19 years old, and I can almost point to where I was sitting at when the Lord changed my life, right? And I remember this light bulb going off, and I was like,
Right.
oh my gosh, right? And all this, just like you had talked about, all this guilt, all this shame fell on me, and I was like, I am so sorry, right? But it was immediately
Yeah.
replaced with this overwhelming sense of love, right? Like I
Hmm.
felt this shame, I felt this guilt. Like I
Right.
realized that I had betrayed Jesus. I realized that everything that I was running from, everything that I was trying to, I was trying to push God away. I remember telling God I hated him and that I wanted him to leave me alone, and all this stuff. I realized that I had betrayed him, right? I felt like Peter did for
Hmm.
just a moment. And then the love of Christ, his arms just surrounded me, right? And I was like, I'm so sorry,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
We find ourselves there. We find ourselves there. That's the redemptive work of Christ in our lives, right?
Right.
And without it, without the redemptive work of Christ in our lives, we we're really doomed to just continue in our path of destruction, right?
Hmm.
And and I thank God that he took that away from me, right? Luckily, I was young, good grief, I'm 42 now, right? So we're talking 23 years ago,
Right.
and because I'm old, it's weird. It's even weird to say. And
What happened? Right.
yeah, yeah, I've got a kid in college, and I've got one married. Like I don't know what happened. My knees hurt now just
Yeah.
getting out of bed, and
I know. I turned 31 last week, and I'm like, what?
yeah,
No,
yeah,
I
no,
don't
it's
see that.
weird, but I do. I look back and I thank God that that he moved on my life, right? And
Hmm.
you know, just like you, even though you had betrayed everything that you knew in Jesus, right? For alcohol and all this stuff, whatever caused it is irrelevant, right? It still happened. There
Right.
was this separation,
Right.
um, but God continued to call you back. And I don't.
Hmm.
I look back now, and and I can visibly remember. I can visibly remember there were moments where God was calling me in my sinful state, right? I
Yep.
remember being,
Just like I talked
yes,
about.
yes. I was 17 years old. I was 17 years old. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, and I remember God just, oh, he was just dealing with me, right? I could just feel his presence, and I'm living a very rebellious life, trying to be as rebellious as I possibly could, because that's the type of
Hmm.
person I was, right? I was just being
Yep.
rebellious just in spite, right? And because that's kind of person I am, right?
Yeah.
And I remember God dealing with me, and I did. I was like, God, I was like, I hate you. Leave me alone, right?
Hmm.
And thank God he never did, right? I
Yeah.
thank him all the time that he realized that I was a stubborn, rebellious child, and
Yeah.
he ignored the it's no different than if you've ever had your kid tell you that they don't like you anymore, or they're angry with you, or they hate you, or all that stuff. You realize that they don't really mean it, right?
Yeah.
And and so I'm thankful that he dealt with me that way, and he continued to pursue me, right, just like he did you. He continued
Hmm.
to pursue you, and here you are, you're 31 years old, and you
Hmm.
are running ultra marathons, and you're waking up, running marathons at 1 a.m. and stuff like that, and witnessing to people about Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Spreading his gospel. And that's amazing. It really is. Not so much the running part, but being able to. Don't worry.
To be happy
Yeah,
about it while you're
yeah.
doing it.
Don't worry. I give JJ such equally a hard time,
Oh no, I don't
and
blame you. He deserves it. If anybody deserves it, that dude's run. I think he got off the arc and he started running ultra marathons, and he's been running them forever.
man, and I tell you what. So he's got a friend of mine. How we met. His name was oh my goodness.
Mike,
Yes, Mike. Thank you. Um,
yeah, Mike
yeah,
McCauley.
and so I met him first, and
Hmm.
he was talking about going running this ultra marathon, right? And I was like, dude, you're
Hmm.
nuts, right? You were crazy. And it's like every person I've met since then, you all are crazy. Every one of you are crazy,
Yeah,
and running all these ultra
I
marathons. And
don't deny it. I was telling a guy about it. Me and JJ were running a race, and I was witnessing to a guy there a couple weeks back, and I told him, I was like, man, this guy has run hundreds of ultra marathons. The guy we were talking to, no kids, not married, just
just
single
runs,
dude, uh, just runs. Yeah, I was like, man, running these things, it's like cramming an entire lifetime worth of highs and lows and ups and downs into like a 6 hour time span. Like, that's the reason why Paul refers to running so much in a lot of the stuff that he
hmm
writes. It's such a great metaphor for life because in that 6 hours you cram, physical pain, mental pain, I mean, you could have two or three, second wins or what they
right,
call them. You could have two or three of those, and you think you're down and out, and then you're not, and you get back up, and you take one more step, and you take one more step, and at the end you finish, and do you want to finish well?
hmm
Do you want to finish, sprinting across the finish line to the other side, you know, which is heaven,
right,
or do you want to come in, dragging, crawling across the finish line, not knowing what's on the other side of it? You can look at it like one big
right.
metaphor. I know that's getting too deep into it,
No,
but
absolutely not.
yeah, that's what I was telling that guy, and um, he probably thought I was on something, or I don't know. JJ's on the other side of him, looking at me like, dude, you need to shut up.
I doubt that.
You're going too deep, man. Yeah, you're going too deep. But
That's great.
yeah.
That's great. And so let me ask you this, and you may not even have an answer for this one, right? So you have at a very young age, you have all this trauma, right? You're a firefighter,
Mhm.
you're voluntary EMT, you're doing all this stuff, and that trauma um, can last for a very long time, most
Mhm.
often lifetimes, right?
Mhm.
How through the redemptive work of Christ, how do you deal with that now? How do you deal with that trauma now?
One of my friends told me something. Actually, JJ told me and him were talking about it one day. I was kind of sharing some of the stuff that I'd gone through with him
Hmm
one morning, and he said something to me that's really stuck with me um, for all of this. And I never said anything, because I'm not going to give him any credit. Um, um, but he stopped me about halfway through whatever I was saying. He's like, man, he's like, you got to remember, all of this is under the blood,
hmm
and that's all he said. He didn't say anything else. He's like, it's all under the blood. Um, and so I look back on that time and all the things that I had to deal with, and were, you know, um, I guess the word you would say would be you had to experience, because you don't have a choice. You don't,
Right.
it's not like you can say, no, I'm not going.
Yeah.
You have to go. You have a duty to act. And, um, I just put all that on God
Yeah.
now. I put all that on Jesus. I can't, if you carry it around with you, it's not going to do you any good.
Right.
Um, and so I've over time just kind of taken that stuff and, it's kind of like unpacking those boxes we were talking about earlier. You unpack them and you air out that old dirty laundry and you look at it and you say, man, I don't need this anymore.
Right.
This is God, this is yours now.
Yes.
You can either use it to strengthen me up to what I'm trying to think of how I want to word this. Like you can either use that to make me a better servant of you,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm going to leave it with you and you can do what you want with it
Right.
later. But I'm not carrying it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's kind of what I've done with it. It may not be the best approach, but um, I just feel like for for me now, like everything in my past, I'm just using to further the Christian
Right.
cause, however I can.
Right.
So, whether it was something that I did or something that I experienced, just that's why I'm
Right.
here, right?
Yeah.
um,
Well,
it's just,
anytime we go through trauma, we have an option, right? We always have an option.
yeah.
And
And I don't know if that was the answer you were looking
no,
for,
that's
but
good.
that's kind of,
That's good.
yeah,
Um, because the two options that we have inevitably will come down
hmm
to we can allow that trauma to destroy us, or
hmm
we can allow God to use that trauma to build us up, right? Um, Oftentimes there is purpose in pain, right? Um,
right,
when you begin to realize that the pain that you are going through, especially when it comes to trauma, um, is not just for you, right? It is for others, right? That you can
hmm
help, you can, you can build other people up, right? It can strengthen me to
right,
be able to minister to other people adequately, right?
hmm
Um, that makes it easier. I don't even know if easier is the right word, right? Um,
more
More
approachable,
approachable,
makes it more,
and I keep on wanting to say easier to bear, right? It makes the load a
okay,
little
yeah,
lighter, right? Maybe that's
okay,
and that's biblical, right? Jesus said, my yoke
hmm
is easy, my burden is light, right? When we begin to
hmm
to give those over to Christ, just like you have, um, they become lighter, right? They don't cast that shadow that they did before. That they don't weigh me down like they did before, because when you begin to give them to Jesus, He begins to carry that weight for you. Right? They're still learning lessons. They're still part of who you are. Right? They're still part of your worldview. They're still part of those types of things. But when you put Christ in the mix of them, Christ is like, hey, let me just take that whole box, right? Let me just carry this entire
yeah,
box for you, and you're not
hmm
going to have to worry about it. You may remember some of this stuff. You're not going to have that, and so your open wound becomes a scar, right? Does that make sense?
hmm yes, sir,
Where you can see a scar, and that scar doesn't hurt anymore, right? But you always remember,
yes, sir,
right? Before you give it to Christ, it's an open wound, and every time you touch it, it's sore. Um, and then if it's not tended to, just like any natural wound, it begins to fester, right? It begins to get infected, and it makes you malice. It makes you angry. It makes you, all these things, right? That emotional and spiritual wounds do to us. But when you begin to give them to God, and He's like, okay, so let me take this. Let me take this. Let me take this off your plate, right? It begins to heal, right? It's like applying medicine to it. And as it begins to heal, it no longer hurts, right? You can talk about it the way you couldn't beforehand. You can,
right, yeah,
all those things, because those wounds now are healed. And
right,
and I think that's amazing. One, you're 31 years old and you've been through a lot, right? You've seen a lot of things that you probably shouldn't have had to see at such a young age,
right,
and you have already figured out that, hey, I can't carry this on my own. I have to give this to Jesus, right? And kudos to you, right? I deal with men consistently that are well older than me, right? Um, that have been dealing with similar things to what you had went through, and they
Right.
still can't give it over to Jesus. They still allow
Mhm.
those, there's still open wounds, and you know they they've been dealing with them for such a long time. They don't even know how, right, to give them to Jesus,
Right. Yeah.
and you know they wouldn't even know they wouldn't even know who they were without them, and that's sad to say, right? But they've
Mhm.
almost the wounds themselves have almost become their identity, and
Yeah.
and that's it's sad, right? It's terrible. That's not the way Jesus, called us to live. He wanted us to give him those things just as you had, and so kudos to you, man. That you
Amen.
were, and I'm sure, just like all of us, you've not got it figured out perfect, and
No.
there's still things that you deal with, right? That never
Yeah.
changes. We're human, and but man, I'm glad to see somebody come out on the other side and
Mhm.
realize that, hey, I need Jesus, right? I
Yeah.
need Jesus. Jesus has got to take this. I've got to give it to him. I've got to be able um, to let him help me process these things. And so, man,
And that was the only option, man, because I, that whole time I thought I was the biggest, baddest. I could handle anything. My shoulders were the broadest. But it got to a point where even I couldn't handle that load
yeah,
anymore. And so I was like, well, who's bigger than me? Who's badder than me?
yeah,
That mentality, and that was the only answer that I could come up with was, Jesus Christ was the only one who's bigger and
that's
badder,
it.
and then knows what I've gone through and what I'm going through. And my story is minuscule to some of them, to people that I've talked to. My troubles were and are nothing compared to so many other people out there. Um, I just it's my story.
Right. Yeah. And it's
Just
powerful. It's powerful, the redemptive work of Christ in our lives, in your life. Um, and here you are, you and your family are now, going to church and serving Jesus, and you're raising your children to go to church and serve Jesus. And, that's the most, that's it,
yeah,
right? When
that's
it comes to,
what we were created
that's it,
for.
and,
Yeah,
you'll never have a more important ministry than that right there. And,
yeah,
I'm glad that you have figured that out. I was in my 30s, and
yeah,
and man, I had been in ministry. I was a children's pastor for 9 years. I've been doing all this stuff, and I realized that, man, I st- it's like I had just guessed the right answer on the test, right? You know what I mean? And I
yeah.
didn't really know what the heck I was doing. You know what I'm saying? And
Uh-huh.
and I was like, Lord, I'm so sorry. Again, I find myself at this place. I had to come back to my wife, and I was like, I'm sorry, I've not been the leader that you've needed. That you deserve.
Yeah.
My children. And I'm thankful now because my children, that they all serve Jesus. My two oldest. I got one that's getting ready to become. He's getting ready to graduate college. Um, he's getting ready to be a worship pastor. I've got one that's studying to be a minister. He's married, and I just,
That's incredible, man.
oh, thank God for grace, right? Thank God for grace,
Yeah,
because
yeah, exactly.
it was not me. What I mean, it was the grace of
Yeah,
God, working through me. Um, I think of all the failures, and I think of all the things even the things that I got right, I vividly remember having to get checked by the Holy Spirit. Don't do it the way you want to do it. You've got to do this different, right? And I'm like, what? you know,
yeah. What do you
yeah,
mean?
yeah. What are you talking about? And so Man, Jeremy, this has been a phenomenal conversation, and I'm so glad that we were able to do
Yeah.
this. And I want to be conscious of your time. I want to be conscious of the listeners' times, and
Yes, sir.
and so I want to give you just a few minutes. If there's anything that you want to tell the guys who are listening, anything like that, whatever it is, have at it.
One verse, two verses that really have stuck with me through this healing process, and through my um, my road back to my faith, I guess, if you could call it, if you want to call it that, is 1 Corinthians 10:13-14. Um, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear.
Mm-hmm.
But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Therefore, my dear friends, free from idolatry. So for me, everything that I was tempted by was man-made.
Mm-hmm.
It was of my own creation. I created my own little world, and I idolized that world,
Mm-hmm.
which was alcohol, and I was using it as a medication, and we are so small compared to God. We are infinitesimally small compared to Him, and thinking that we can do things on our own. We can deal with these problems on our own.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way. Um, and you just gotta find a way to give it to Him and put it at His feet, and just let Him take that load, because He can. You know, He can bear that burden. As you were
Mm-hmm.
saying. Um, and then the same with the shame and the guilt, that comes from that. It's like you said, we all experience it. We all feel that, and there's not a man that's going to listen to this, or you know that's hasn't felt that, and I certainly have too, and I struggle with that a lot, maybe more than the alcohol. I struggle with the shame and the guilt and not feeling worthy enough. Um, but you got to put that aside, man. You can't. You know, God loves us for who we are, and He created us in His image,
Mm-hmm.
um, and He created us, and we're not perfect. We all sin. We sin daily, every day, all of us. Um, and so if you walk around with that kind of shame and guilt, it just eats you up, and you just got to learn to let that go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, that's pretty much all I
Man,
got,
that's
man.
good.
Uh,
That's a good ending, man. That's a mic
yeah.
drop moment right there, and that is an excellent way to end this podcast. And so, Jeremy, it has been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Yes, sir.
Uh,
I've enjoyed being here. I've been nervous. I've been so nervous about this all day. I'm like, man, what am I going to talk to this guy about? Like, I'm just some hick who just used to drink, and now I don't. I don't have a story. Uh,
oh, but you
but
do, and it's everybody's story, man. It's
yeah,
everybody's story, and
I
so
guess so, man. Well, I appreciate your time, dude. I don't want to be strangers. I definitely reach out anytime.
yeah, and likewise. And so I'm going to land this plane. And so all you guys who are listening to this, I hope you enjoyed. I know you'll enjoy Jeremy's testimony, and I want to remind you guys about the book Framework for Biblical Masculinity. I want to remind you guys that if you guys have got any questions, email me realmen@palaceofpraise.com. You can find us on social media, Facebook, TikTok, all the good jazz. And so, and know that God loves you. He is for you. He does not want you to carry the guilt and shame, just like Jeremy said. He does not want you to carry that with you. He wants to take those burdens from you. And as always,
Amen.
I want to end in a prayer. Holy Spirit, teach us to be leaders of our homes, of our communities, of our churches. Teach us to be godly, courageous men. In Jesus' name, amen.
You've been listening to Real Men Talk. If you'd like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email, realmen@palaceofpraise.com, or visit our website at realmenministries.us. You can also message us through social media. If you're a man age 16 and up and would like to be a part of the conversation, join us at the Palace of Praise every Thursday night at 6:30 p.m. If you don't have a home church, consider joining us for worship on Sundays at 10:30 a.m. and 6 p.m. Palace of Praise is located at 1400 Herschel Best Boulevard in Poplar Bluff, Missouri. New episodes of Real Men Talk drop every Thursday at 5 p.m. on all major podcast platforms. You can also find us on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, X, and Facebook. Real Men Talk is a production of Real Men Studios in cooperation with Palace Media Services.